What if the man you trusted to fix your spine was the very one who destroyed it? What if the surgeon in charge of your life walked into the operating room knowing he was going to ruin it? This isn't a script. This isn't an urban legend. This is the true story of Dr. Christopher Duntsch, a man in a white coat, a trained neurosurgeon, a rising star in Texas medicine. He had the credentials, the charm, and the confidence. He convinced everyone, hospitals, colleagues, even his closest friends, that he was born to operate. But one by one his patients began to fall. They came to him walking and left in wheelchairs. They came to him speaking and left unable to breathe without a machine. Some never left at all. 33 surgeries. 33 lives permanently altered. 2 never made it off the table. And through it all, Dr. Duntsch kept going, cutting, stitching, drilling, like nothing was wrong. What was happening inside those operating rooms? Was it incompetence or something far worse? This is the case that shocked the medical world. A doctor who acted like a predator. A man who wrote in an email, "I am a motherfucking stone cold killer." This is not just about one man. It's about a system that looked the other way. Hospitals that passed the problem along. Red flags buried beneath paperwork and silence. And in the end it took the law to do what medicine wouldn't. This is the story of Dr. Christopher Duntsch. This is Dr. Death. If you think this story is disturbing, it's only the beginning. Subscribe now and turn on your notification bell icon for more true crime cases that don't just shock you, they stay with you. Christopher Duntsch was born in Memphis, Tennessee, into a well-off family with all the advantages that might shape a bright and promising future. Raised in privilege and opportunity, he was the kind of boy who seemed destined to succeed, ambitious, focused, intelligent, and eventually admired for what appeared to be relentless drive. He enrolled at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, where he went on to earn not only a medical degree but also a PhD, an achievement that, on paper, positioned him as an elite neurosurgeon, trained to handle the most complex and delicate structures in the human body, the brain and spine. But while his academic credentials sparkled, the man behind them was unraveling into someone very different. As he advanced through his training, troubling stories began to circulate, claims that Duntsch was not only partying heavily, but allegedly using cocaine and LSD even during his medical residency, with some former colleagues suggesting he was known to show up to surgeries after sleepless nights filled with drugs, alcohol, and women. These weren't just rumors whispered in locker rooms. There were real concerns raised by fellow residents and attending physicians about his judgment, his ethics, and his complete disregard for standard medical protocols. Some claimed he skipped steps in procedures, rushed surgeries he wasn't ready to perform, and ignored supervisors who warned him he was putting patients at risk. He cultivated an image of brilliance, calling himself a cutting-edge pioneer in spinal surgery, and yet his actions told a different story, a story of arrogance without discipline, of ambition without skill. Former mentors quietly questioned whether he had even completed the required number of surgeries during training, while colleagues described him as someone who acted like he was smarter than everyone else in the room but lacked the steady hands and technical ability to back it up. And despite these glaring red flags, despite the whispers, the warnings, and the incidents, Duntsch wasn't stopped. Instead, he was endorsed. He received glowing letters of recommendation. He passed through the system with full credentials, unchecked and unchallenged. By the time he arrived in Texas to begin practicing, the party lifestyle had simply followed him. He projected confidence, selling himself to hospitals as a revolutionary in the field, claiming to offer patients life-altering results. He told them he was at the cutting edge of neurosurgery, a savant who would make their pain vanish, their mobility return, their lives improve. Patients believed him. Hospitals welcomed him. Colleagues were intrigued by him. But no one looked deeper. No one asked the right questions. And no one could imagine what was about to happen. A former friend, reflecting later on their relationship, would say, "He thought he was smarter than everyone. But he didn't have the skills to back it up." At the time, that statement may have sounded like simple criticism. In hindsight, it was a chilling prophecy. Because behind the smile, the credentials, the sharp suits and persuasive voice, there was something else growing, something dangerous. The man who held a scalpel over vulnerable patients wasn't just inexperienced. He wasn't just reckless. He was something far worse. And the question that still haunts everyone touched by his story is simple and horrifying. How does someone so unqualified, so unstable, and so clearly dangerous end up holding the fate of human lives in his hands? What came next was not just a failure of medicine. It was a nightmare in a white coat. By the time Dr. Christopher Duntsch began practicing independently in Texas, the damage was almost immediate, swift, brutal, and unrelenting. In a matter of just a few short months, the operating room had become a place of chaos and devastation. And at the center of it all was a man who either didn't understand the damage he was causing, or didn't care. His very first known victim was not a stranger, not a patient pulled from a hospital waiting room, but his own childhood best friend, Jerry Summers. Jerry trusted Chris with everything. They had grown up together, gone through the highs and lows of youth, and stood beside each other for decades. So when Jerry needed help with chronic neck pain, he turned to the one man he believed would never fail him. But during what should have been a routine spinal procedure, Duntsch made error after error. He severed key ligaments, damaged vital structures, and left Jerry a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the neck down. That one surgery should have been the end. It should have raised every alarm. But instead, it was only the beginning. Next came Kelly Martin, a vibrant woman who entered Baylor Regional Medical Center in Plano for what was expected to be a straightforward procedure. Hours after surgery, Kelly began bleeding internally, profusely. Nurses noticed signs of distress, called for help, sounded the alarms, but it was too late. Kelly bled to death. A mother, a wife, gone. The medical reports were damning. Duntsch had sliced through critical blood vessels, then left the surgical site in disarray. Her family never even got a chance to say goodbye. Then there was Floella Brown. She came to Duntsch hoping for relief from spinal compression. Instead, during surgery he cut her vertebral artery, leading to a massive stroke. She was left brain dead. Her death was slow, agonizing for her family to witness. Another preventable tragedy. Another life reduced to a cautionary tale. And yet, no one stopped him. Mary Efford, a woman in her 70s, was one of the most horrific cases. After her surgery with Duntsch, she was left maimed beyond comprehension. Her spine was butchered, screws were placed in muscle rather than bone, and surgical hardware was inserted upside down. When another surgeon later attempted to repair the damage, he was horrified to discover that Duntsch had left surgical tools inside her body. Mary's life was forever altered: chronic pain, immobility, and eventually a leg amputation. Lee Passmore, another patient, went in hoping for pain relief. He came out with severe, chronic pain that he would carry for the rest of his life. Nerve damage so extensive that even the smallest movement triggered agony. Philip Mayfield, once active and strong, emerged from Duntsch's or permanently paralyzed, losing control over basic bodily functions. The list continued. Jeff Cheney, who suffered damage to his voice box and throat, unable to speak without strain, his voice forever altered. Joseph Hutchinson, who endured excruciating pain and lifelong complications. And then there was Don Efford, Mary's husband, who didn't go under the knife, but whose life was equally destroyed by watching his wife's suffering, helpless to do anything about it. There were more, dozens more. Some of their names never made headlines, but their lives were left in tatters. People who went in for simple procedures and came out with crushed nerves, paralyzed limbs, bodies that no longer functioned, minds consumed by pain. For many, the suffering didn't stop when the surgery ended, it began. Inside the operating room, staff members grew terrified. Nurses and anesthesiologists repeatedly reported his behavior to hospital administrators, sounding the alarm, describing procedures that went wildly off course, and recounting the fear that patients were being maimed in real time. They spoke of surgeries drenched in blood, of instruments misused, of reckless movements and complete disregard for surgical protocol. They talked about how he would drill screws into soft tissue, how he ignored critical imaging, how he would blame others when things went wrong, even as patients screamed in pain. One nurse reportedly said, "I've never seen anything like it. I didn't think it was possible for a licensed surgeon to be this dangerous." The horror extended beyond the table. After every surgery, another person left broken, another family left in disbelief, another hospital note filled with clinical words that barely touched the truth. And as the numbers piled up, over 31 victims and just 10 known surgeries, the real question grew louder. Why wasn't he stopped? He left people bleeding, broken, and dead. He created a trail of suffering so obvious it was impossible to ignore. And yet, somehow, hospital after hospital allowed him to keep operating. Administrators signed off. Legal departments went quiet. Colleagues whispered in hallways but did little more. The surgical carnage wasn't hidden. It was there, plain as day, documented, reported, undeniable. So why did hospitals, fully aware something was very, very wrong, keep letting him operate? What if the very institutions we trust to heal us, prestigious hospitals, regulatory boards, peer review committees, became accomplices in our suffering? What if the checks and balances we believe exist to protect us simply didn't? This isn't just the story of one man's catastrophic malpractice. This is a portrait of institutional failure so profound, so unervingly quiet, that it allowed a dangerously unqualified surgeon to continue operating on human spines, time and time again, even as the bodies piled up. It all began at Baylor Regional Medical Center at Plano, a facility with a reputation for excellence, where Dr. Christopher Duntsch began his private practice career. By then there were already whispers. Staff noted erratic behavior in the OR. Post-op complications mounted. Nurses and anesthesiologists filed internal concerns. Patients, once hopeful, left disfigured, maimed, or never walked again. Still, no formal investigation was launched. Instead, Baylor executives reached a stunning decision. They allowed Duntsch to resign voluntarily. There would be no disciplinary report, no alert to the Texas Medical Board, no flag to future employers or patients. In fact, Baylor went a step further. They issued him a letter of recommendation. Glowing, unblemished, praising his capabilities, endorsing his future. With that letter, Duntsch moved easily to Dallas Medical Center. There was no background check thorough enough to uncover the patients already in wheelchairs, no probing of outcomes from previous procedures, no audit of his performance or inquiry into the warnings left behind. Within weeks, patients there too began to suffer. And yet again, no one stopped him. From there, he moved through the Texas healthcare system like a virus, infecting hospitals one by one, under the radar, unchecked. Legacy Surgery Center, University General Hospital, Southampton Community Healthcare, they all welcomed him. Each time the paperwork followed. But never the truth. No one mentioned the trail of ruined lives, the ruined backs, the ruined families. No one disclosed what he'd left behind. It's not that the warning signs weren't there, they were. Loud. Repeated. Escalating. But instead of triggering action, they triggered silence. Why? Because hospitals feared liability. They feared bad press, lawsuits, reputation damage. They feared losing donors, insurance contracts, federal funding. And so, executives made the calculation. It was easier to pass him off than to hold him accountable. Behind closed doors, internal memos revealed concerns. Words like reckless, incompetent, even dangerous appeared in private communications. But those words never reached the people who mattered most. The patients. The families. The next in line for surgery. The next in line to suffer. And the mechanisms meant to prevent this kind of catastrophe? They failed just as profoundly. The National Practitioner Data Bank, the system designed to record and share information about medical negligence, was rendered toothless by red tape and clever omission. Hospitals used loopholes to avoid reporting. Warnings were vague, records delayed, outcomes underreported or never submitted. The data bank sat empty, silent, while more people were wheeled into surgery. Even among peer physicians, silence dominated. Some surgeons reviewed Duntsch's cases and were horrified. X-rays that made no sense, screws lodged in muscle instead of bone, arteries sliced through with no plan for repair. But speaking out meant risking everything. Their jobs, their licenses, their reputations in a tight-knit community. Many chose to turn their heads. And yet they knew. They all knew. This wasn't just one man's hubris. It was an industry's quiet complicity. Hospitals that claimed to champion patient safety instead enabled one of the most dangerous surgeons in American history. Dr. Duntsch continued his ruthless, careless killing even as he went to Dallas area hospitals, not minding the consequences of his actions till the answer came not from a hospital board or a government agency, but from two men who had finally had enough. Dr. Robert Henderson, a respected spinal surgeon, had seen his fair share of difficult cases. He was the kind of physician other doctors trusted when things went wrong, the one they called to pick up the pieces. But nothing could have prepared him for the aftermath of Mary Efford's surgery. She had walked into the hospital for a routine spinal procedure and emerged maimed beyond comprehension. When Henderson opened her up to try and correct the damage, what he found inside wasn't just a mistake. It was carnage. Instruments had been misused. Screws were placed into soft tissue instead of bone. Nerve roots were severed or crushed. Vital anatomy had been mangled as if by someone who had no idea what they were doing, or didn't care. He stood over the operating table, stunned. In all his years of practice he had never seen anything like it. He later described the scene as the most horrific thing I'd ever seen in my life. But even more disturbing than what had been done was who had done it. A man still being allowed to operate under the protection of prestigious institutions. A man other doctors were too afraid or too slow to stop. Henderson knew then that this wasn't just about Mary Efford. This was bigger. This was a pattern of destruction, A deliberate continuation of chaos under the cover of medicine, and someone needed to shine a light on it before more people suffered. He began pulling records, reading, researching, connecting the dots. And when the pattern became impossible to ignore, he reached out to a colleague who shared his concern, Dr. Randall Kirby. Kirby, a blunt and brilliant vascular surgeon, had long been suspicious of Dr. Christopher Duntsch. He'd heard the stories, the bizarre patient outcomes, the whispers of incompetence, the angry families. He wasn't one to mince words, and he didn't need to see much to call it what it was. In his own words, Duntsch is a sociopath. He needs to be stopped. Together, Henderson and Kirby formed an unlikely alliance. Two physicians going toe-to-toe not just with a rogue colleague, but with the very institutions that had allowed him to thrive. They began writing letters. Not one, not two, but dozens. Letters to hospital boards. Letters to the Texas Medical Board. Letters to the district attorney's office, to local newspapers, to anyone who would listen. They weren't quiet about it either. They included photographs, patient charts, surgical logs. They documented the outcomes in brutal detail: paralyzed limbs, crushed spinal cords, shredded muscles, severed arteries, screws inserted upside down, surgical tools left behind. They named names. They exposed timelines. And still, no one acted quickly. Because that's the problem with institutions. They are built to protect themselves. And when faced with the choice of public scandal or silent resignation, most chose the latter. Duntsch had been passed from hospital to hospital, shielded by loopholes, peer fear, and a failure of oversight, each institution more eager to get rid of the problem quietly than to raise the alarm. But Henderson and Kirby refused to let the silence win. Eventually their persistence paid off. One of their letters landed on the desk of Dallas County Assistant District Attorney Michelle Shugart, a former nurse turned prosecutor. Shugart didn't just see the case through the lens of the law. She understood the language of the operating room, the weight of a misstep during surgery, the consequences of even a single reckless decision under anesthesia. As she read through the files, case by case, a picture began to form. A picture not of a doctor making mistakes, but of a man operating with complete disregard for human life. And while it's rare, almost unheard of, for criminal charges to be brought against a physician for what could be seen as malpractice, Shugart knew this was no ordinary case. She began building what would become one of the most groundbreaking prosecutions in modern American medical history. And the charge? Injury to an elderly person. Specifically, Mary Efford, the patient whose spine had been butchered so badly that Henderson himself could barely comprehend it. It was a strategic move. Murder would be harder to prove. Intent would be debated endlessly. But injury to an elderly person, a first-degree felony in Texas, allowed them to focus on reckless, knowing harm rather than proving homicidal intent. With that charge, they could open the doors to every surgical room Duntsch had ever walked into, and bring every victim's story into the courtroom. But none of it, would have happened if two doctors hadn't stepped forward and said, enough. Henderson and Kirby risked their careers, their reputations, even their personal safety. They faced backlash, skepticism, bureaucratic hurdles, and apathy. But they never stopped. They showed up in court. They testified. They sat beside the families who had lost everything. And they made sure the truth wasn't buried under legal briefs or hospital press releases. In the end, they weren't just whistleblowers. They were the only ones willing to stand between a scalpel and the next victim. And as the trial loomed ahead, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This was the first time a surgeon would be criminally prosecuted in the United States for actions committed inside the operating room, not for what he failed to do, but for what he knowingly chose to do. Justice, once slow and silent, was finally on the move. When the courtroom doors opened in early 2017 and the trial of Dr. Christopher Duntsch finally began, it was more than a legal proceeding, it was a confrontation, a reckoning. A moment when years of pain, denial, cover-ups, and devastation were brought into the light under the cold gaze of the law. Inside that room sat over 36 witnesses, some broken, some angry, all changed forever by their encounter with a man who had once worn the title of doctor. Among them were survivors still grappling with their new reality, people who could no longer walk, who could no longer move, who woke up from what was supposed to be a healing procedure only to find themselves trapped in bodies that no longer worked. And there were others, families of the dead. Mothers, husbands, daughters, and sons who stood behind the witness stand with photographs, medical records, and trembling voices. They spoke about the final days of their loved ones, about the surgeries that went wrong, about the confusion, the silence, and the growing horror that followed. One by one they shared how trust turned into trauma, and how the operating room, a place meant for healing, had become a slaughterhouse under Duntsch's hands. Then came the nurses, the anesthesiologists, the fellow doctors. Those who had been there, who had seen the blood loss, the misplaced screws, the chaos behind the surgical drape. They spoke of warnings that went unanswered, of higher-ups who looked the other way, of a healthcare system that failed to stop the damage when it had the chance. Their testimonies painted a picture that was hard to believe but impossible to ignore. A man wholly unfit to operate had been allowed to do so again and again, while the bodies stacked up. But perhaps the most chilling moment of the entire trial didn't come from a witness. It came from a piece of evidence, an email written by Duntsch himself. Short, direct, terrifying in its coldness. He wrote, "I am a motherfucking stone-cold killer." There it was. In his own words. Not an accusation. Not an interpretation. But a declaration. A line that stopped the room cold. It wasn't just about negligence. It wasn't just about arrogance. It was a window into the mind of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And kept doing it. The jury didn't need days to deliberate. They didn't need to pore over complicated legal arguments or question intent. They listened. They read. They remembered the faces of those who testified. And in just a matter of hours, they reached a verdict that would echo across the nation. Guilty. Sentenced to life in prison. It was a historic ruling. The first time in American legal history that a physician had been criminally convicted for actions committed inside the operating room. Not for fraud. Not for malpractice lawsuits settled behind closed doors. But for the brutal, irreversible harm he had caused under the guise of care. That verdict didn't just end one man's reign of terror, it forced an entire system to look inward. Across the United States, hospitals and regulatory bodies began re-examining how they review complaints, how they document misconduct, and most importantly, how they protect patients. The trial forced a national conversation about the frightening ease with which a dangerous doctor could slip through the cracks of bureaucracy, reputation, and fear of litigation. It also elevated the voices of those who had been ignored. Whistleblowers like Dr. Robert Henderson and Dr. Randall Kirby, who had risked their careers, their reputations, and even their safety to sound the alarm, were finally vindicated. And for the survivors, the families, and the grieving loved ones, that courtroom became a place where they could, at long last, be heard. The man known as Dr. Death would never step foot in an operating room again. His name would go down in infamy, not as a healer but as a warning. And though the damage could never be undone, the conviction stood as a rare and powerful message. No matter the title you wear, if you harm under the mask of care, justice will come for you. In the wake of Dr. Christopher Duntsch's conviction, a wave of reckoning swept through the medical world. Hospitals, once protected by bureaucracy and complacency, were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that silence had allowed a man to mutilate, maim, and kill while wearing a white coat. Boards that once turned a blind eye began re-evaluating their peer review processes, digging into how red flags had been missed, or worse, ignored, again and again. Behind the clinical walls, a quiet shift began. New policies were drafted. Loopholes that once allowed dangerous doctors to move undetected from one hospital to another were scrutinized. Systems that once prioritized reputation over responsibility were being rebuilt. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Outside those walls, the voices of the victims and their families refused to fade. For them, justice wasn't just a verdict, it was a mission, a responsibility, a way to ensure that no one else would ever go through what they had endured. They spoke at conferences. They lobbied for change. They gave interviews. They told their stories again and again, sometimes through tears, sometimes through rage, always through pain. Dr. Christopher Duntsch may never leave prison, but his legacy of terror has reshaped medicine. This case proves that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they wear scrubs. If this story disturbed you as much as it did us, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below. Do you think hospitals should face criminal charges for enabling killers like this? And don't miss next episode, the nurse who killed patients with insulin. You won't believe what she got away with.